Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, the ICC goes after Israel's prime minister and head of Hamas in the same breath. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi killed in a helicopter crash. What does it mean for Iran, Israel, and the Middle East? Plus, a warning to the U.S. and West about the rise of radical Islam. An Iranian-born filmmaker continues his mission of murals to honor the brave protesters of Iran. And a musical message of hope and courage to the Iranian underground church. All this and more on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Reaction has been fast and furious against the International Criminal Court's move to get arrest warrants for the leaders of Israel and Hamas. But some countries have actually supported the ICC. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has the story.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the decision a moral outrage of historic proportions that would cast an everlasting mark of shame on the International Court.
Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage.
Netanyahu's response came after the ICC's chief prosecutor said Monday he's seeking arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as 3 Hamas leaders, including Yahya Sinwar, for war crimes and crimes against humanity in connection with the current war. Israel's Knesset also swiftly opposed the ICC's action. Despite their political differences, a huge majority, 106 out of 120 Knesset members, signed a statement condemning the ICC's accusations. The statement says in part, the scandalous comparison by the Hague prosecutor between Israel's leaders and the heads of terror organizations is an unerasable historic crime and a clear expression of anti-Semitism. Israeli President Isaac Herzog said the decision only emboldens terrorists around the world.
We will not forget who started this war, who raped, butchered, burned, brutalized, and kidnapped innocent civilians and families. We will not forget our hostages, whose safe return should be the main concern of the international community.
President Biden also opposed the allegations against Israel.
Let me be clear. We reject the ICC's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Contrary to allegations against Israel made by the International Court of Justice, what's happening is not genocide.
Internationally, France and Belgium backed the ICC's move for arrest warrants, but Italy called it unacceptable and absurd. Netanyahu said the charges against him were meant to take away Israel's right to self-defense, but he made it clear it would not stop the war against Hamas.
Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice. What a disgrace.
And while the ICC is accusing Israeli leaders of war crimes, the IDF says it has evacuated about 950,000 civilians in just 2 weeks from Rafah. Around 300,000 to 400,000 civilians remain, mostly in the coastal area. The speedy evacuation took place despite U.S. predictions that it would take about 4 months and high death tolls to get civilians out of the area. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A day before the ICC announcement, other earth-shaking news. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, Iran's foreign minister, and other officials were killed when their helicopter crashed into a mountain. World leaders sent condolences for the man known as the Butcher of Tehran. Others want to know what effect his death will have in Iran, the Middle East, and beyond. To discuss the impact of Raisi's death, I spoke to Eli Kohanim, a senior fellow at the International Women's Forum, an Iranian-born American. Ellie Coney, great to have you here and get your perspective. First of all, what's your reaction to the death of Ibrahim Raisi?
Chris, I am celebrating along with millions of Iranians who, when they celebrate on the streets of Iran we've seen on social media videos, setting off fireworks, sharing funny memes, people dancing in the streets, children of political dissidents who lost a parent, cheering with drinks to each other. I join them in their happiness because the man who died in that helicopter crash is known as the Butcher of Tehran in Iran.
Yeah, he killed thousands, I bet, back in the 1980s, 1988, and then in 2019 slaughtered about 1,500 people during those protests. So he earned that reputation then.
Exactly right. Like you said, Chris, Raisi, the president of Iran who just died, was personally responsible overseeing these kangaroo court systems, which at most gave people these fake trials, 5-minute show trials. And he was responsible for one of the greatest mass executions of political prisoners in human history.
Where do you see this affecting inside Iran and the region as well, the Middle East?
Well, Chris, this is where it gets very interesting. So President Raisi was one of just 2 people who was in line for succession to be the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The supreme leader is the highest position of office in Iran. The supreme leader right now is the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who really has the sole decision-making power, and it's an incredibly powerful position. So in line for succession, because Khamenei is now in his 80s, and people understand that at any minute he will die, and that's another day that will be a day of celebration for millions. But in line for succession for Khamenei were Raisi and his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. So it seems that at the moment we have only Mojtaba left, which does create some problems because, first of all, there are different factions that are vying for power. But also, if Khamenei's son were to become the next supreme leader, you've then instituted in Iran a hereditary system. And the irony is that this regime came to so-called liberate Iran from the monarchy, which was a hereditary system, the Pahlavi dynasty, before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So many people will legitimately take issue with such a thing occurring. So a lot of potential for unrest in the next short time period.
How do you think the U.S. should respond to this development?
Well, the U.S. Today, sadly, we saw in the United Nations one of our UN ambassadors participate in the moment of silence, and that is exactly the wrong thing to do. We need to see the United States stand purely and only with the people of Iran, the victims of this horrific, human rights abuser, a man who had so much blood on his hands, and in fact, also, Chris, just before I joined you, I did see that the United States, even through the State Department, issued a formal condolence on the death of Raisi. That is not what anyone would expect on the death of a mass murderer. So it's really disappointing for us, I think, to see our government showing a complete lack of moral clarity in a moment like this.
Yeah, and I would add, I saw on your your Twitter account that you said there should be maximum pressure on the regime, maximum support for the people of Iran, and I recommend people check that out on your X account. Ellie Conan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
Up next, a sober warning about the rise of radical Islam from a Middle East expert and the danger it poses to the West. Many are saying that Israel's war against Hamas is only the beginning of radical Islam's war against the West. I spoke with Yigal Carmon of the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, about that. He is urging the West to wake up and realize that radical Islam has a goal of taking over the world. Yigal Carmon, thanks for joining us. You wrote an article I thought was fascinating, really a clarion call, I think, to the West for such a time as this. It says, from canary in the coal mine to phoenix rising from the ashes. What did you want to communicate through this article?
Well, thank you for having me, Chris. It's an article that identifies the problem to the very details of it, because it's a multifaceted problem in the West and in the Middle East, and explains how to get out of it. So, number one, identifying the problem. For the first time in decades, three problems converged, separate ones, converged into one. The survival of Israel in this hateful area of the Middle East. Second, the survival of international Jewry, the diaspora, that is now under threats of violence and discrimination, and horribly much worse than that. And the third is the survival of Western civilization with its values that have developed over the years, which we all know and somehow were pushed aside by the protesters. And I say this is a very dangerous situation, and Israel fighting the Hamas and all those who support it is a canary in a coal mine that is warning the miners of the deteriorating level of oxygen in Western civilization, because the battle is against Western civilization no less than it is against Israel. And they say it, in the protesters in America are saying it, the Islamists in the Middle East are saying it. This is a world war against the world. It is Raed Salah, the head of the Islamic movement in Israel, says, quotes a hadith, a tradition, a small army of my believers will conquer the White House. Now, of course, in the tradition, it was meant, the White House was the Persian Empire, but he describes it as a prophecy of the White House to come, the White House of today. Another one says this is a theological and religious war. It is the war against Western civilization, which is regarded by them as the enemy. And Western civilization, unfortunately, dropped its capability to defend itself. And there were stages in that process. Number one, America dropped the principle that everyone that comes to America should integrate into the melting pot. Now, instead of the principle of integration, a new principle entered: multiculturalism. What does this multiculturalism say? That all values are equal. All values, the values of those who murder their mothers and their sisters on so-called honor, family honor, those who throw LGBT people to die with their head down, those who coerce Christians everywhere in the Middle East, in Nigeria, those who do not allow freedom of speech, of thought, of religion, all those are equal to our values, the Western civilization values. The situation is such that the battle against Israel converged with the battle against Western civilization by all those students who are totally misguided, who support the Hamas that wants to convert them all by force. It's had it not been a tragedy, it would be a joke.
Yeah. Well, it's a sobering analysis of where we are today, and I highly recommend this article, as well as documented with all the links to what you do on memory. So, Yigal Karman, thanks for sharing with us this important message.
Thank you, Chris.
Coming up, an Iranian-born filmmaker continues his mission of murals to celebrate the courageous protesters of Iran. We've been following this story since the beginning. Iranian-American filmmaker Houman Halili has been commissioning murals throughout Israel and working with Israeli artists to support the Iranian women and others protesting against the Islamic regime. Take a look. These two murals are the 11th and 12th in a series of 18 murals. Halili's goal is to tell Israelis how much the Iranian people love Israel and that Israelis support the people of Iran.
I really prayed with a lot of people. I got a lot of wise counsel around me, and it seemed like this is what God's plan was. To use these murals as an avenue to remind the world that the Persians have been the friends of the Jews for 3,000 years. I always write on the murals, it's time for the Esthers of the world to rise up. But Esther is only Esther because of Mordecai. And Tumaj is a modern-day Mordecai.
Iranian rap artist Tumaj Shalehi was recently sentenced to death by the Islamic regime for standing with Women Life Freedom protests.
His music supports the women of Iran. It emboldens them. It gives them the courage to keep fighting. So when you say, what's the relationship between Tumaj and Israel? The world sees that the Jews are standing with the freedom-fighting people of Iran.
Former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan Nahum, has been a big part of this project.
Once the Islamic Republic of Iran started specifically cracking down on women, killing women, taking women prisoners for showing a strand of hair, we decided, the women of Israel, the feminists of Israel, decided to speak out. It's important for us as Israelis and as Jews that the people of Iran know that we're friends. We are all facing the same oppression. Hamas are the long arm of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And what I think people around the world don't realize is that we all have the same enemy, the enemy to freedom of religion, freedom of expression, women's rights, and everything else is all coming out of the same place.
Halili commissioned Israeli artists who share Halili's passion and identify with the plight of Tumaj.
As an Israeli, I feel so much for the Iranian people that they're suffering from this crazy regime. As an artist, I'm happy that I can donate something for my talent in this world to do something to save this man and all the other people in Iran. Two nations that want to be free. One day it will be freedom to Iran, freedom to Israel from this crazy regime.
Emily Schrader and Hassan Nahum partner with Halili on this project to strengthen the bridge between Israelis and the Iranian people.
After October 7th, we've continued to push forward these murals all across Israel, in Arab cities like Nazareth or in the heart of Jerusalem. We want everyone, every single Israeli, to understand that we have a shared destiny with the people of Iran, and that this is something that has thousands of years of history from the time of Cyrus the Great, and this is also how the Iranian people view it. And I think that a lot of people inside of Israel are only now starting to realize that the Iranian society, the Iranian people, are 110% behind Israel.
Here we are at the 12th Woman Life Freedom mural. This mural is very special, and we have a Bible verse here for Tumaj. Psalm 31:5, his life is in your hands, Lord. Rescue Tumaj from his enemies and from those who hunt him down.
Still ahead, a musical message of hope to the secret believers in Iran living out their faith under the shadow of tyranny. Yaron Cherniak is an Israeli musician who has a heart for the people of Iran. He took on a special musical project to help and encourage the underground church of Iran.
So you're very connected to this region. Your music's very connected.
For some reason, it was just on my heart so much to develop and produce and widen the repertoire of worship music in Farsi, in classical forms. So first of all, what you do is to learn about the culture, about the history, about the background of the culture, background of Iran, What is a Shia Muslim country? What is in terms of culture, of feasts? What they do there? What about their poetry? You have to learn their poetry, their classic forms. And then, of course, as a musician, I started to dig in their music tradition. So that's the idea, is to speak the language of the people, their rhymes, their rhythms, their poetry, their language, not to touch it, not to try to westernize it. And the goal is to reach out to traditional societies, especially in Iran, where the underground church is facing persecution and oppression by the regime, the Islamic regime. And sometimes in those traditional societies, Western worship music, sometimes it's almost an obstacle for the traditional person. When he listened to that, he shut the door immediately. For them, their sound, it represents something, and a traditional sound represents their authenticity, their identity, their history. Their history is connected to something much more ancient than the rock music or jazz music or any other, you name it. Their music is very well rooted in their past. But what I do is to really send them, to use it as a way to communicate with them, to say, I'm not trying to change your culture is amazing. I just want to share with you this love to God and to the Son of God, Yeshua, that this is the way for you to find life and light.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and you can access CBN content and through our CBN News and other CBN apps. Please continue to pray for Israel at this critical moment and for the speedy return of the hostages. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.